Hi, thanks for having me. So anyway, the title of this presentation is Stopping Stupid. And what happened is frequently I get complaints like, oh, I call people stupid and everything. And then I hear complaints about this presentation, for example. Everybody is like, oh, you're calling users stupid. It's like, nah, not necessarily the case. I like to start with a story. So one time I was doing a penetration test. I call it an espionage simulation, where I was basically had a friend with me, and we were infiltrating a Fortune 500 company. And I told him, okay, here's the deal. We're going to walk through in the morning with the rush, morning rush, and we're going to follow everybody diagonally through the main lobby to the left, and then we're going to go upstairs, find an empty office, and then we'll work from there. And then there's a receptionist in the middle, just basically ignore her. So anyway, we start walking and, act like we're on our phones. We walk through the main lobby, we'll go in the elevator, go upstairs, and the elevator had, by the way, ID swipe cards to be able to go upstairs, but everybody pretty much was getting on during the morning rush, and they were swiping every floor. We got off at a random floor, walked around, found an empty conference room. We went ahead, and I just got on the phone, and I started calling people up, and I said, hi, I'm the CIO. How do I get badges for my contractors? Got forwarded around a couple times, and then anyway get forwarded to somebody who says, oh, just send them down to the lobby. So me and my accomplice walk down to the lobby, and then what happens is there's the receptionist, and she's like, I saw you two go by and I tried to stop you. And I'm like, oh, we were on our phones. I'm sorry, did we, it wasn't intentional. She's like, oh, you look busy. I didn't want to bother you. And then she's like, oh, and we're like, okay, thanks. And then what happens is she calls over a security guard. The guard comes and she's like, these two gentlemen need badges. Can you please arrange that? And she's like, and the guard says, sure. So anyway, the guard takes us to the little guard room where we get our pictures taken. And as we're waiting for the badges to be printed up, the guard's like, so what do you two guys do? And I go, computer stuff. And the guard goes, oh, well, are you going to need access to the server room? And I go, as a matter of fact, we will. So the guard goes, okay, well, I'll make sure when your badges are printed up that you have access to the server room as well. It might take a couple hours for the computer system to acknowledge that, but anyway, I go, okay, we can wait, not a problem. So we get the badges, then about pretty much a couple hours go by right during lunchtime. Me and my accomplice go down to the basement where we assume the server room's going to be, and then we swipe it. We find the door that opens up, we walk in, and then there we are in the server room, and the primary domain controller for the Windows network is left logged on with admin privileges, and we go ahead and add a new user as an admin as well to the admin system, or to the primary domain controller. Then of course we had full control over the entire network, and pretty much we were done. So anyway, write that up in my report, and then about 3 weeks later I get a call from I get a call from somebody who says, I'm in charge of physical security for the facility. I need to know the name of the guard who gave you the badge. And I go, excuse me. Then he repeats himself. I go, well, here's the problem. I go, I'm not giving you the name of the guard who gave you the badge, number one. And I go, if you want to have the name of the guard who gave me the badge, you have to ask the CIO, who's the person I report to, and I will give that badge to that person, but that's the only person I report to and give information to. And then I should warn you that if the CIO asks me for the name of the guard, I will give him the name of the guard, but I will also tell him that the fact the guard gave me the badge is bad. The fact you don't know who the guard is even worse. So anyway, obviously I never heard from the CIO, but here's the point. Everybody, when I tell the story to, thinks the guard was an idiot. The guard was not an idiot. The guard was not quote unquote stupid. The guard did everything everybody in the organization led the guard to do. Apparently the only checking was the nice receptionist told the guards, okay, this person should get in, this person shouldn't. That's not a process. There was no authentication. The fact they didn't register badges that were given out, again, really, really a bad thing. but the guard was just following their processes, and the fact that it wasn't even listed who gave out badges when was horrifying to me. So anyway, when you stop and think who's stupid, start to think it's not the people who you assume are doing the stupid things. But now, what is stupid? There is a dictionary definition. And in general, it's having or showing a great lack of intelligence or common sense. So let's break this down. Are you hiring people who display a great lack of intelligence? If you are, I contend that hiring stupid people is your fault. You know, and even if you have to hire people who show a great lack of intelligence, why do you put these people in a position to cause harm in the first place? You know, you might need somebody like this, but you don't give them unretained abilities and so on. And then what about hiring people without common sense? Now, in the first place, there's a psychological principle back to my psychology days. You can't have common sense without common knowledge. And if somebody doesn't have common sense, it means you haven't provided them with common knowledge. And if you haven't provided the people without the common knowledge, again, whose fault is it? Again, I put that back to the people who are running the, it's like the inmates are running the asylum in theory, as the expression would go. You have to provide people common knowledge so they can exercise common sense. That's a given. So now who's the stupid one, like I mentioned before? Again, if you're hiring people who are quote unquote stupid, it is your fault for hiring them and put them in the position where they can create the loss. So now here's the other part. Now I'm talking about, you can't stop stupid and all this, but, at the end of the day, it's not really you. Because when we look at the whole concept of human error, what have you been, what have you as a security professional been told? You've been told, I call this a bunch of ignorant crap. You've been told these accolades of, we are creating the human firewall. We want the users to be the last line of defense. We think users are your first line of defense. And again, I don't know if the concept of bro science translates around the world, but if you see people who work out like the gym bros, as they're called, like in health clubs, the bros there, protein bro, take your protein, all that sort of stuff. Here's the problem. You have all these people who tell you to go ahead and study these sciences like psychology, like influence. And what the problem is, these people are focusing on the proximity of the error. In other words, if an error occurs, they blame the user because the user is there. Then they say, well, if the user is there where the error occurs, we need to just fix the user. That is the wrong way of looking at it. And again, I'm going to go into this in a little bit, but safety science, for example, dictates something differently. The user being in the proximity of the error, it's not this. It's kind of like medical. For example, if somebody dies in a hospital, the first inclination is to blame the doctor because they committed that one act that in theory killed the user. The reality, though, is when you go back and study, there's a whole decision tree that led the doctor to be in that position. And the act the doctor took in the moment where the person in theory might have died, the reality is there might be 100 acts taken before that where the decision was made, where a decision might have been made a different way and the patient would have lived. Not at the exact moment where the patient died, but hours before the patient died. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. Because generally, if you look at the analogy it kind of uses, when a user makes a mistake, everybody says, oh, we just need a better, more aware user. That's like saying if a canary dies in a coal mine, the solution is to have healthier canaries. That is not the purpose of a canary. The reason canaries die in a coal mine is because there's poisonous gas in the coal mine. And you have to study how did the poisonous gas get to the point where the canary died. Likewise, when a user makes a mistake, you have to study the process of how a user got in the position to make a mistake that caused damage. Now, I don't know, I like TV references, and many of them, well, at least in some places, if you're old enough, you'll recognize this guy as Newman. Newman is from the TV show Seinfeld, which was, worldwide. But anyway, this just shows Newman, who's kind of not a very smart person doing accounting. And I use Newman as the example because here's the thing: accounting as a discipline expects the users to make mistakes. That's why there's audits. Accounting knows that users cause damage. They track financial resources from start to finish. That is the purpose of accounting. And your goal, and what accountants do, is they figure out, okay, how do users get in the position where they are going to make accounting errors? And then they figure out proactively, how can we filter them out? Let's create disciplines. Let's go ahead and create spreadsheets. Let's track every financial allocation from start to finish. And then at the point where a user does something, they go ahead and they track that as well. Then once they go ahead and track what a user does and supposedly tell an accountant or a financial person, here's how you enter the data, then they have audits. And most important, the audit doesn't figure out who does bad things. The audit figures out where do things not match, and then they proactively figure out, well, they reactively figure out where did the matching not add up properly. And they do forensic accounting, they do audits, they do whatever they need to do. But again, from start to finish in the financial processes, it's an assumption that a user is there to do a job, but might create an error, and the process is there to filter out errors proactively. Now here's scuba diving. A lot of people don't know, and there's no reason you should, I'm also a master scuba diver trainer. I love scuba diving, and I go ahead and I love it so much, I decided, how can I do it more? I became a teacher just so I could do it more. And what happened was, when I started hearing, the first time I ever heard the expression, you can't stop stupid, was in the dive instructor training, where our dive instructor, I guess technically he's the course director, says you can't stop stupid, and trying to stop people from doing stupid things. The reality was, I'm sitting here thinking, our whole instructor training is really to quote unquote stop stupid. We are here, for example, because before a student is allowed in the water, in the first place, they have to go ahead. They have to have a physical done. So we know they're not just going to die from bad health in the water. We know they're not going to have an incident. They also have to have a swim test to make sure that they're at least comfortable in the water. Not necessarily that they're a great swimmer, but at least they're not going to freak out inside the water. So that's another thing. Then generally, before you put a diver in the water, they have to take training. Training is all about how to dive safely. It's about a little bit of the science behind it, but it's mostly how to react appropriately in different situations and so on, so they're less likely to have an accident and create injury. Then when we put them in a pool, we don't just say, here's the ocean, go ahead. We put them in a pool and have them demonstrate basic skills in a pool. We show them the equipment, how to set it up. Then once we skip ahead, then to put them in the water and test them, we put them in controlled water just to a given level of depth where they're monitored. And then, like, there's insurance along the way. There's, everybody's insured. We know where medical facilities are. But the whole process of scuba diving has made scuba diving statistically safer than bowling, which again is a true statistic. But either way, another thing, the picture on the screen shows people being certified. Now again, you see the instructor, which I don't think I can necessarily point, but there's one of the people who's surrounded is the instructor, and he's trying to watch one student at a time do their dive skills. A smart instructor also, however, brings, if you see the red circle, a dive master or assistant instructor to watch everybody, because when you're doing this, you're not going to be able to look at everybody at all times. So this is a critical factor that you have to understand, that this scuba diving builds in the fact that people will potentially be quote unquote stupid, but you plan for stupid, which is the critical factor. So again, safety science, another discipline. In safety science, they look at the user as part of the system. And if you adapt that, a user is as much a part of your systems as the computer itself is. Just because a user is using the computer, it doesn't mean they're different. They're part of the system. And they realize that an incident results from failure of the entire system. So if something happens, the entire system has failed, not the user. And that's a powerful concept, because the user's just in the proximity of the error that was allowed to initiate loss. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. On your screen now are a bunch of Boeing 737 MAX jets. And, unfortunately, more than 300 people died because the 737 MAX jets, 2 of them out of many crashed, and there were many more incidents averted because of pilots saving the planes. Now, what happened was, in theory, when the incidents occurred, the first thing people wanted to do was blame the pilots, because the planes essentially steered themselves into the ground and the pilots didn't stop it. And that obviously was a bad thing, but was it really pilot error that was the cause? And now the question is, could the pilots have theoretically saved the plane? The answer is yes. But the problem is, the cause was the software and faulty sensors, because what happened was the Boeing 737 MAX jets were deemed by the safety authorities or the aviation authorities as being similar enough to the 737, 800, 900, and the rest of the series that you didn't need specialized training for the 737 MAX jets. The problem was that during the design of the 737 MAX jets, they changed key functions within the airplane itself. For example, there are these AOAs, angle of attack sensors on sides of the planes. There's 2 of them. So just in case one malfunctions, you got a second one. The problem is when they malfunction, there used to be an indicator that there is a discrepancy between the 2. In the design of the 737 MAX software, they took that out as a mandatory feature and made it an option to let the pilot know there's a discrepancy between the 2 sensors. And they didn't train the pilots to know that. They didn't train the pilots to know that, okay, if there's a discrepancy. They also changed the software to rule that the jets were doing something wrong and that the jets were going down. And if you understand aviation, and this is it's counterintuitive, but when a plane is going down, it means that the speed is too slow. And the way you add speed is to aim the plane into the ground, which causes the plane to accelerate, and then it gets more lift, which supposedly saves the plane. In this case, the plane thought it was losing speed and heading down, so the plane turned its nose down and sped itself up. And unless the pilot knew to turn off the autopilot, the plane was headed for disaster. And some pilots would turn it off, but not realizing that was the source, they turned it back on, which again aimed it to the ground. And the pilots were just one cog in a very complicated fail system. So anyway, where does blame usually fall when a user makes a mistake? In safety science, they found that blame falls 90% because of the environment. So for example, when I was doing an assessment or trying to create an awareness program for a manufacturing company, they gave me a tour of the facility with a safety science person in tow. And the safety science person was telling us that there used to be many accidents where forklifts were driving into people, or people were walking into forklifts that were working inside their warehouse. And what they did was, he says, we went through a lot of decision making and we decided we're just going to go ahead and paint a line down the floor that said people stay to one side and forklifts stay to the other. And that got rid of 90% of all the accidents by defining where people were supposed to walk. So again, that's one issue. He's like, a lot of incidents occurred because we had equipment falling on people's, on people's feet, like a heavy wrench would fall on somebody. And so what they did was they went ahead and they painted the silhouette of a heavy wrench, for example, and said when the wrench is not in use, the wrench goes back on the wall where the silhouette is. And people were able to very quickly see what was there, what wasn't. and that helped, again, save a lot of injuries. By the way, it also helped cut down theft, because if you ever walk by at the end of the day and saw, the silhouette of a wrench, somebody stole that wrench. So anyway, that's where the issue lies. When you study incidents in general, you will find the environment causes the incident, not the specific user action. Or, well, the user makes an action, but the action is caused by the user, the environment. So now when we talk about the 10%, where a user is quote unquote at fault, where the environment is otherwise strong, the 10% could be carelessness, could be ignorance, in other words, just not knowing what to do. It could be lack of training. It could be malice. In our field, we like to think of this user as a paragon of virtue. There's a lot of incidents. If you look at the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, 28% of incidents in one of the latest studies are due to specifically malfeasance on the part of people. In other words, if there's an incident, there's malice on the part of an employee a significant percentage of the time. Anyway, so now when you look at this slide, because here's the thing, awareness is really only 20% of that 10%. And what I mean by that is, if a user is like, so if 90% of the acts are the environment, or attributed to the environment, 10% are attributed to the user. If you have an awareness program, that's only going to take care of 20%. And let's talk about this. This is essentially applied behavioral science. And the reason I say this is antecedents are essentially awareness. You tell somebody what to do, and that is supposed to influence behavior. A behavior triggers a consequence. A consequence then goes back and either reinforces or it might encourage the behavior. So for example, if in a common example, if you tell a child that don't put your hand on this, on this plate because the plate is hot, the child is going to go ahead and put their hand on the plate eventually. Why? They hear you, but there's a hesitance, but they'll still eventually do it just to see if that's correct. Then what happens is they actually burn their hand, and they're going to go ahead, and that's going to teach them not to put their hand back on the plate. However, what happens if the plate really isn't that hot? The child's going to learn, you know what? You told me the plate was hot. It was kind of warm, not really hot. I'm not necessarily going to listen to you next time. So in reality, the key issue is, statistically, consequences have 80% of the potential for behavior change, while giving people information, in other words, awareness, is only going to influence people 20%. So in other words, if you tell somebody you can't reuse a password because hackers will steal it, what happens if somebody reuses the password? Even 99% of the time, people don't have any problems with their password. So they do something they're not supposed to. There's no consequence, so that just encourages them to reuse the password yet again. Those are critical issues to understand when you're designing your awareness program. So anyway, what you need to do again is generate consequences, which is gamification. Let's also talk now, here's a concept of counterterrorism. In counterterrorism, they use the concept of the terrorist act is boom. So before the terrorist act occurs is left a boom. After the terrorist act occurs is right a boom. And the goal is, obviously you potentially want to stop the terrorist attack itself, and that is what you try to do in left a boom. But simultaneously, if you're a good person who wants to really stop it, you have to understand something is going to get through. So you have to proactively plan for the act happening. So in left a boom, for example, in a terrorist attack, you might go ahead and say, let me know who the terrorists are. Let me try to stop the terrorists before they do their acts. Again, you would even think it's like, okay, let's also try to harden the potential terrorist targets. And you might go ahead and implement barriers in front of the potential buildings. You might implement metal detectors and so on. And that's what you do left a boom. You try to stop the attacks from existing and try to potentially decrease potential damage should they be successful. At boom, there are different things. For example, in airplanes, what happens is they have the luggage carriers that are bomb resistant. So should a bomb go off in a luggage hold, you go ahead and the luggage bins go ahead and contain the potential blast so it doesn't bring down the plane, just as a quick example. In Write-A-Boom, you have to make sure that hospitals are set up appropriately. You have to make sure that first responders are trained how to go ahead and go into an area, trying to avoid secondary explosions, because terrorists want to go ahead, create a primary explosion, bring in the first responders, and then again have a secondary explosion to damage the people responding and so on. And you want to make sure all of this occurs. That is the concept of boom. But we want to go ahead and adopt that for our cybersecurity roles, where users are essentially the point of boom. So I think I brought this up before, but again, you have prevention and protection leading up to the boom to try to eliminate it. When you can't eliminate the boom itself, you have to understand how to do response, recovery, and restoration. Now, each phase involves its own form of protection, detection, and reaction. And here's the critical focus and why I use this concept and address that with user-initiated losses, I'm calling it. With 90% of attacks, according to all studies, 90% of all serious attacks occur where the user is the trigger for the attack itself. And that's critical. So again, we look at user is the proximity of where the attack is not initiated, but where the attack is realized. So if a user clicks on a phishing message, the attack is realized when the user actually clicks on the phishing message. So anyway, before left-A-Boom, we have protection, detection, and reaction. At boom, we have protection, detection, and reaction, and right-A-Boom, protection, detection, and reaction. Now, I want to introduce the concept, and I've been mentioning it, but user-initiated loss. Just because, and I'm going to use phishing as an example because it's quick. Just because a user clicks on a phishing message, it doesn't mean your network should be destroyed. It doesn't mean there should be a compromise. A user can take an action, but the action does not have to result in damage or loss. This is why I call it user-initiated loss. If a user takes an action, they have initiated a potential sequence of events, but it doesn't mean loss has to be realized. So your goal is to ideally stop left-A-Boom. You want to stop a potential attack from reaching the user where a user can initiate it. Then at the point of boom, you want to stop the user from initiating a loss to the best of your ability. So that might be awareness. It also might be a better user experience, which filters it out. But then right-A-Boom. The user initiated the loss. Why are you not proactively mitigating the damage? That's critical. So again, at all phases, we're talking user-initiated loss. In left-A-Boom, prevent the user from being in a position to initiate the loss. In other words, you might take the user out of the whole decision-making process. You can re-engineer, like for example, I use McDonald's lately as an example. McDonald's has put in kiosks to replace cashiers around the world. If you put in a kiosk where the user's inputting their own information, now the cashier can't make an error in mishearing what the user's saying. Likewise, you also are taking away the potential for a cashier to steal money, either from the store or from the customer. So that's another critical factor. So again, in left-A-Boom, you're stopping the potential. You're also going ahead and creating a culture. Culture creates consequences to assist. In other words, we're having people go ahead and act securely, proactively, and that's critical. So you want to try to go ahead and create a loss prevention culture as best you can. And also users might create in detection. For example, if a user potentially sees a phishing message, a user sees somebody coming into the building, they can stop the person or alert the guards that there's somebody walking around facilities and so on. Governance. Are all organizational processes clearly defined? In other words, you have to tell a user how they're supposed to behave. More frequently, awareness just tells people what they should be afraid of. Governance should be able to tell a person, here's how you do your job correctly. And you need to define how people do their jobs correctly in detail. And this is a phase most security professionals don't do, and this could be a presentation itself. but governance is key. You need to define how people do their jobs securely, not what people should be afraid of. At point of boom, this is where the user is presented with the opportunity to initiate loss. And again, do they do it? Do they detect it? Do they prevent it? Do they sound the alarm? In other words, not just prevent it, but let somebody know there's something wrong. And remember, this could be due to accident, carelessness, malice, or whatever. You need to just remember that when a user's in the position to initiate loss, do they do it or not? And again, this could be due to user experience, this could be due to awareness, whatever the cause may be. And this again is policies and governance. You know, I use the analogy of Elmer Fudd, and I don't know how many people around the world these days remember Elmer Fudd, but he was Bugs Bunny's nemesis. Look it up, Google it. And what happened is Elmer Fudd was kind of not very bright, and he was always on the lookout for the wascally wabbit trying to catch Bugs Bunny. Now, if Bugs Bunny would dress in a dress and wear a wig, Elmer Fudd couldn't recognize him. And the problem is, the reason I use this analogy, when you're there telling your users what to be afraid of, if it somehow puts on a dress and a wig, your users will not recognize it. So you should be telling your people not what to be afraid of, but how they should act appropriately at all times. That's what your awareness program should be, driven by policy and governance. Right a boom, again, loss has been initiated. Does your environment proactively detect it? Just because a user clicks on a phishing message, it doesn't mean the phishing message has to create damage. If a user doesn't have admin privileges, they can't go ahead download malware. If you have web content filtering, that should potentially stop the user from downloading malware. It should stop them from sending out critical information, like data leak protection should stop users from sending out critical files or whatever the case is. Most important, and here's the critical, at Right a Boom, do you go back and do a post-mortem? Do you analyze where the incidents occurred, how they occurred, and so on? So in other words, what enabled the incident, what caused the incident, what could have been prevented? Likewise, if the incident could have been worse, where did you get lucky, and figure that out, because frequently that happens as well. But just remember, the proximity, just because the user initiated the loss, that's not the right and only place to look. You have to look at the whole system. It sounds difficult, but when there's an accident, safety science does this from start to finish. When there's a financial loss, accounting does this. If there's an operational issue where a factory is impacted, operations does this from start to finish. Cybersecurity has to do this as well. And like I mentioned before, if 90% of incidents result from some form of user-initiated loss, you can go ahead, and this can pretty much address most of the other incidents as well. Let's talk about CEO fraud, where just as a quick example, so I've had a case where somebody goes ahead and pretends to be the CEO and requests somebody to send out critical information or send out money. And what happens is somebody sends an email message appearing to be from the CEO to a financial analyst. And how can that be stopped, where they're asking a financial analyst to send out money? What happens is you can left a boom. You filter out potential phishing messages. You could tag a message and say, this might not be from the CEO, or you don't care who it's from. This came from outside the organization, so flag it as external. At the point of boom, where a financial person is potentially looking at the message, or they're looking at it, what's the process for the release of PII? Or what's the process for the initiation of financial transactions? And these people need to have training in this sort of information. What is the training in the process of how do you release PII or money or whatever else? And then you need to reinforce the process at the point of boom. Asking people, do you have permission? Has the right person authorized this? At Right a Boom, you warn people, you pretty much are sitting there and you're saying, hey, is this person sending out money? What is the process for this? What was the authorization process? Is there data leak prevention if they're sending out sensitive files to catch the files before it goes out to somebody and so on? And this is just one case where you look at everything, stop the people from being in the position, and then assume they did something wrong. How do they go ahead and address it? And again, handling a PII as a whole, not just when somebody's imitating the CEO. When somebody's, going ahead and asking for any types of PII, what's the process for release? Data leak prevention stops a whole massive plethora of attacks. Filtering of incoming email messages on servers, again, critical for filtering out all types of attacks, tagging mail as external, warning of attachments, and so on. And again, if you can mitigate 90% of attacks by robust countermeasures, that'll pretty much take care of most of the other 10%. But, just consider that in the future. Awareness is still mandatory. People say, wow, you're telling people why not to go ahead and use awareness. It's like, no, awareness is still a critical piece of risk reduction. Awareness is incredibly less expensive than many countermeasures. Awareness is a fail-safe. You still need to have awareness. And here's the critical concept, and here's one reason why I really get on the awareness profession. Awareness is just a tactic within the overall security program. Are you just throwing tactics at a strategic problem? You need to have a strategy. The problem is not a user, not being aware. The problem is a user can initiate and create a loss, and that requires a strategy of technology, process, and awareness. And you need to make sure it's all put together. So you need a strategy, not just awareness as a tactic. And again, the most important takeaway, your people are not canaries in a coal mine. I should say, yes, you don't want a canary dying from a heart attack or old age, but at the same time, if a canary does die, it's a symptom of the overall problem. Anyway, time for question and answer.